He was born completely wrong, at least as far as every other gorilla in that zoo was concerned. White fur in a species that's supposed to be black. Pink skin. Pale blue eyes that squinted against light every other gorilla around him could tolerate without a second thought. And from the moment they saw him, every single gorilla who looked at him reacted the exact same way: fear, confusion, total rejection, immediate and visceral, like something in their instincts refused to even process what they were looking at. The infant was dying of loneliness, not illness. Then somebody noticed one old silverback nobody else wanted either. Barcelona Zoo, 1966. A scream cut through the observation room the first time researchers tried an introduction. Nina, a gentle, experienced mother who'd raised infants of her own without incident, backed away from the mesh barrier so fast she nearly tripped over herself, eyes wide with something close to genuine terror, like the white fur alone had triggered an alarm decades of evolution had wired into her. If a story like this is worth your time, go ahead and subscribe now. And write in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Okay, here's how bad it had actually gotten by that point. 5 gorillas. 3 days. 5 identical reactions: fear, confusion, rejection, every single time. No exceptions, no gradual warming up. The infant, barely 10 pounds and 9 months old, sat alone making the soft distress calls a baby gorilla makes when it wants its mother, over and over, into an enclosure where nobody answered. But his mother was dead, killed by farmers in Equatorial Guinea 6 months earlier, and nobody at that zoo wanted to take her place. They'd named him Copito de Neve, Snowflake, the only albino gorilla anyone had ever documented in recorded history. Nothing's wrong with him, one researcher kept telling colleagues who asked, more times than he probably wanted to count. He's just different, and gorillas don't understand different. I don't know how many people, watching those 5 rejections stack up one after another, would have kept trying a 6th time, a 7th. The staff had already introduced Snowflake to females, juveniles, young males, even other albino animals entirely, white peacocks, white deer, hoping something, anything, would spark recognition instead of fear. Nothing worked. And Snowflake was suffering for it, developmentally and physically, in a way staff genuinely feared could kill him even though nothing was medically wrong. There has to be someone, one of the keepers said, watching Snowflake reach through the mesh toward Nina one more time, only for her to turn her back completely. That's when someone noticed the old silverback. He'd once led a thriving troop. 3 years earlier, a younger male had challenged him and won. And since then he'd lived alone in an isolation enclosure, watching the family he used to lead through a barrier he could no longer cross. An outcast, in his own way, exactly like the infant nobody wanted. Nobody had considered him before. Male silverbacks, deposed or not, weren't exactly known for their patience toward infants that weren't their own, and staff had every reason to expect he'd react the same way every other gorilla had. But watching him through the connecting window, something about the way he kept turning his head toward Snowflake's enclosure, as if he could hear the distress calls through the walls even when nobody else seemed to register them, made at least one researcher stop and reconsider. What if being alone has changed him? That researcher said quietly, watching the old male stare back toward the enclosure that used to be his, toward a family that had moved on entirely without him. What if 3 years of isolation had worn down whatever instinct made every other gorilla recoil? What if he's lonely enough to accept anyone, even a white gorilla? It's dangerous, a colleague warned immediately, if he becomes aggressive with an infant that size. But right now, that infant is dying, came the answer, flat and certain. Not physically, not yet, but inside, in a way that wouldn't show up on any exam, the same way the isolation was probably eating away at the old silverback without leaving a mark anyone could point to. And if we don't try something, we lose him anyway, slowly, the same way we might already be losing the one sitting alone in that other enclosure. Here's something worth understanding about gorilla troops before we go any further, because it's the reason this specific pairing wasn't as strange as it first sounds. Deposed silverbacks who've lost their position often become socially isolated for years afterward, sometimes permanently, since a younger dominant male typically won't tolerate a rival's continued presence near the group he now controls. They moved Snowflake's enclosure next to the old silverbacks, close enough to see and smell each other through the mesh, separated for safety in case the pairing went the way every other introduction had. For an entire day, the silverback didn't even acknowledge the infant's presence, sitting in his usual corner while Snowflake made soft distress calls a few feet away, oblivious or indifferent, nobody could quite tell which. The second day was the same, and by the end of it, more than one person on staff had started quietly preparing to call this attempt a failure too, just like all the others. I'll admit, if I'd been watching those first 2 days, I'd have assumed this was already over before it started. Give it time, someone kept saying, though nobody watching those monitors fully believed it themselves anymore, not after 5 previous failures had all followed the exact same pattern of hope curdling into disappointment. On the third day, everything changed. Snowflake pressed himself against the barrier, one small pink hand reaching through into empty air. The old silverback turned his head. Those tired eyes locked onto the white infant for a long moment, long enough that everyone watching stopped breathing entirely. Then, slowly, 300 pounds of muscle stood and crossed the enclosure toward a 10-pound infant that looked nothing like him. He stopped at the barrier, looked down, and reached through the mesh with a hand capable of crushing bone, touching Snowflake's outstretched fingers with something that could only be described as gentleness. Snowflake made a sound that wasn't distress this time. It was hope, and the old silverback answered with a low rumbling call, the exact sound adult gorillas use to comfort infants that aren't afraid of them. For the following week, the two of them stayed at that barrier for hours daily. Grooming through the mesh, awkward but genuine. Sounds passed back and forth that nobody needed to translate to understand. On the 8th day, someone made the call to open the barrier completely. Snowflake stepped through first, cautious, pale eyes wide. The old silverback sat perfectly still, waiting the way you wait for something you're afraid might still change its mind. Snowflake took another step, then another, until he stood directly in front of him. Then, with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for an animal his size, the silverback reached out and pulled the white infant close. That night, keepers monitoring via infrared watched him build a sleeping nest for the first time in months. He'd stopped bothering, alone and isolated as he'd been, simply sleeping on bare ground most nights instead. This nest was larger than he needed, large enough for 2. He lifted Snowflake into the center of it, then curled his own body around him, one arm draped over the infant like a wall nothing was getting through. Blood work the following morning told its own story. The old silverback's stress hormones had dropped by roughly 40% overnight. Snowflake's had normalized for the first time since arriving at that zoo. They're healing each other, one researcher said, reviewing the charts. He was dying from isolation. Snowflake was dying from rejection. Together, they'd both started choosing to live instead. Over the following months, the old silverback taught Snowflake everything a young gorilla needs to know: how to chest beat, how to vocalize properly, how to build a nest of his own, all of it patiently, repeatedly, the way you'd teach a son who genuinely struggled to get it right the first time. Snowflake's albinism kept creating problems the silverback couldn't fix through teaching alone. His pink skin burned under direct sun within minutes. His pale eyes couldn't tolerate bright light the way the other gorillas could. When the young ones tried playing in open sunlight, Snowflake would retreat to shade within minutes, alone. The old silverback noticed every single time, and started moving to sit beside him in the shade instead, which meant, within a group that structured itself around wherever he chose to be, that the family simply reorganized itself around Snowflake's limitations without anyone forcing the issue. A year later, a new female was introduced to the group. She froze at the sight of Snowflake exactly the way every gorilla before her had. Then she noticed the old silverback sitting calmly beside him, entirely unbothered, and something in her hesitation shifted. If he wasn't afraid, why should she be? She approached, touched his fur, started grooming him, the same as she would any other gorilla in the troop. One by one, the rest followed the same pattern. Not because anyone explained anything to them. Because the most respected animal in that entire group had already decided Snowflake belonged, and the others recalibrated their own instincts against his example. When Snowflake was 4, A newly arrived young male, bigger and more aggressive, charged at him with the classic display of intimidation every young challenger uses. Snowflake backed away, pale eyes wide with the same fear he'd shown as an infant. The old silverback, nearly 40 by then and considerably slower than he used to be, stepped between them anyway. Full height, chest out, a vocalization that needed no translation for anyone watching. Touch him and you deal with me. The younger male hesitated, then backed down completely, and never challenged Snowflake again. Personally, I think that moment says more about what actually happened between them than almost anything else in this story. An old, half-retired silverback, well past his prime, still willing to physically put himself between a young challenger and an infant that wasn't even his own, purely because he decided, years earlier, that this one was his to protect. The years kept moving. Snowflake grew into a full silverback himself, eventually fathering more than 20 offspring, none of them albino but everyone carrying the gene forward. He became, without ever choosing it, the most famous gorilla in the world. Magazine covers, international attention, an entire generation of people who learned what albinism was because of him specifically. Through all of it, he stayed close to the old silverback who'd taken him in. When his adoptive father finally died at around 44 years old, found peacefully in his sleeping nest one morning, Snowflake, 20 years old himself by then, fully grown, had climbed into that same nest sometime during the night. He wouldn't leave the body. Staff waited 2 full days before he finally stepped away on his own, having gone that entire time without eating or sleeping, grooming him, making the same soft sounds he'd made as an infant, saying goodbye the only way he knew how. After that, Snowflake took on a version of the old silverback's role himself, not as dominant male necessarily, but as the one who approached new, struggling arrivals first, the way he'd once been approached by somebody willing to see past what made him different. He lived to around 40 himself, eventually dying of the same skin cancer his condition had always made likely. Even in his final months, keepers noticed him choosing to sit in the exact spot the old silverback used to rest in, decades after his death, as if some part of him was still looking for the one who'd chosen him when nobody else would. 2 outcasts, rejected for completely different reasons, one for a color he never chose and one for losing a fight age had made him lose eventually anyway. Finding, somehow, exactly what the other one needed at exactly the moment neither of them had anyone else left. Do you think an animal that's been rejected by everyone can still recognize kindness the very first time it's finally offered to him, or does trust like that have to be built slowly, the same way it would for us? Write yes if you believe Snowflake knew, in that moment at the barrier, exactly what was being given to him. Subscribe if this one got to you. Thanks for listening. See you in the next one.